Oh, the iconic green box. This will be the first time we've had one of these on the channel before. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Adam. This is Weekend Watch Repair, and I'm really glad you stopped by. Thank you so much. We have a real special project on the bench today. What we're looking at is a ladies' Rolex Oyster Perpetual model 67193 from 1998. This is a two-tone watch of 18 karat gold and stainless steel. This watch was purchased by my friend Scott, who is wanting to give his daughter a very special Christmas gift this year. And it was kind of forced onto me. I wasn't planning on doing this watch actually, and I'll kind of tell you that story, but I'm not displeased that I had an opportunity to work on this thing. So as we kind of begin to get into this real quick, and we're doing a close inspection, and I noticed that right underneath the crystal, we'll zoom in here, there's a little moisture ring around the center of the hands, right on the underside of the crystal. Kind of odd. But my friend Scott bought this watch locally, and the paperwork he got with it said that it had last been serviced 12 years ago. And he'd called me and wanted to know if I could go through it. And originally, I directed him towards a authorized dealer who has, from what I've heard by all accounts, is a very qualified, certified Rolex watchmaker. But they couldn't get to it by Christmas. So, but he really wanted his daughter to get this watch. So, I'm kind of taking up the mantle on this project. His daughter is named Becky. Here's her photo. Becky is a certified flight nurse with over 1,000 transports, spent 12 years in the NIC unit as a nurse there, and she's just an absolute rock star. So, the pressure's on, and there's no way I could allow this watch to be sitting on a waiting list and not be ready for her by Christmas. So here's the project. And so this is what we're doing. I've been assured by Scott that, she's doesn't regularly watch, YouTube watch repair videos. So there's really no risk in ruining the surprise for her by showing this video. She won't know of its existence until she receives this watch at Christmas. But, I couldn't turn Scott away. When I directed him towards a certified Rolex watchmaker, he contacted them and they said, there's just no way that they could get to it before Christmas. And checking the case back there, there's a kind of Sharpie for a watchmaker's mark. There's one etched into the back of the case back, but that Sharpie one, and that Sharpie's going to go away as soon as we clean it. We noticed a little bit of a helicopter effect with the rotor. The winding on this watch was very, very rough. And when that rotor spins, when we're turning the crown, that's a symptom of us having a reversing wheel problem. So we'll just put it on the time grapher real quick to take a measurement to begin with. This watch was originally chronometer certified, and I don't remember the exact specifications. It may be -2 to +5 or -2 to +6 seconds per day across all positions, something like that. We're running a bit slow, amplitude's a bit low, beat error's out of whack, but it looks like it just needs to be serviced. And as we dig into this watch, we're going to find that the last service it got was definitely not from Rolex. And I'm not saying, I'm not a Rolex certified watchmaker either, but it's a bit sloppy. And we'll kind of get into it and you'll see why. But this watch needed to come on the workbench, and I'm really glad to have it. So we're going to do some close inspection here before we dig into this and just see kind of what we're looking at. And it's a beautiful movement. You can see those reversing wheels we have a problem with, those purple wheels we'll talk about later. Right here, in order to remove the movement from the case, those case screws you can see have like a wide shoulder on it. And as we rotate it around, see that opening in the case right there? In order to remove this case, you actually have to screw those screws. You have to tighten them, turn them downwards, and that will loosen the watch in the case. And then we can rotate the movement inside the case in between those openings, and it'll give clearance for those screws to come out. But before we get to that point, we need to go ahead and remove the automatic works first. And so we're going to remove these two screws and take out the complete module. And I'll tell you, it's really blown up on the screen. It looks giant. This is the smallest watch I've ever had on my workbench. I haven't done a whole lot of ladies movements, and mechanically they're basically the same, just everything's smaller and on a scale that everything's small to begin with. So, I'm trying to be very careful. Obviously we're working on a Rolex, and this is a very high quality movement. And as we really get into this, and you'll see, these things, they're built and they're gorgeous looking. They're finished just beautifully, but they're very robust movements. And that's kind of what Rolex originally was when it first came out. Today they hold that moniker of being this high luxury brand, and they are, but they're extremely well made and tough and resilient. And that was kind of that philosophy still kind of is how they're made today. Their watches are not delicate. They're tough and they're extremely well made, but they're also very finely and finished and everything else. So, it's a pleasure to work on it. It really is. I'm kind of glad if I got to work on a ladies movement, I would probably prefer it to be this Rolex because they're just so well made, and I can really tell when I'm working on it. I can see that and how the parts fit together and everything else. So we'll go ahead and separate the movement from the case, and you can see how we had to rotate that around. We have a beautiful blue dial, and those indices and the hands and the logo are all gold on this. So with my most delicate touch that I can muster, we're going to go ahead and remove these hands using some plastic to protect the dial. And you can see on that dial, moisture had got into this watch. Clearly, you saw that ring on the underside of the crystal. And it's just a few tiny places that really you can only see when we're under shooting in macro. There's no way it's even visible when you're just looking at it with the naked eye. But a little bit had got in underneath the lacquer on the dial, so there's a few little spots, but it is completely non-noticeable unless you're looking at it through extremely high magnification. The dials on these are press fitted on, and it's a pretty loose press fit. The dial's really secured to the movement when it's mounted in the watch. We're going to begin just by removing the hour wheel and the cannon pinion. That way, we can flip this movement over, and the reason we remove the cannon pinion now is so that we can take out, it's not really a center wheel on this watch as it really is the minute pinion. Here you can see more evidence of kind of what we're going to find. There's a lot of excessive oil in this thing. We need to remove power for the watch. And so what I'm doing is on the right side, depressing the click and releasing tension. And normally you can let the crown just unwind between your fingers, but this one will not unwind under its own power. I'm having to manually turn it. But once we remove all the power from the mainspring, you can see the balance stop. Now we can go ahead and remove this balance from the watch now. And again, this is easily the most delicate part on the watch. This is actually a free sprung balance. You'll notice on that balance wheel, there's only one arm. And that's the arm really where the stud is. And it's not really so much a stud as it is a clamp that holds the hairspring. But in order to regulate the time on this watch, there's not an arm you press. You actually adjust what are called microstella screws on the actual balance rim itself. We'll kind of get into that later. But just a gorgeous, gorgeous balance. Next up is the pallet fork. And again, I kind of marveled at this pallet fork bridge. It's stunningly beautiful. All those screw heads you can see have a black polish on it. So, and what black polish is, it's a polish where the surface is so even all the way across. The reason they call it a black polish is if light, it'll look completely black unless the light is reflecting directly at you. And so, on a normal one, you can kind of see half a screw head or half of a part. You'll see shine on a part of it, but not all of it. On a black polish part, everything will kind of reflect directly back at you. And look at all that oil underneath that pallet fork. That is not good, folks. But on a black polish part, if it's not reflecting light directly at you, it appears black. But that's because the polish and the surface level of the part is so even. It's not an easy thing to accomplish. And you can see all those screw heads, for the most part, they'll just appear black unless the light reflects directly at the camera, and then you can see the whole thing shine. And so that's what black polish is. What I'm doing here is I'm going to remove this capstone now while this bridge is in place, because it's going to have to be removed for cleaning, and it's just so much easier to do it now rather than once it's off the watch and then to remount the bridge just to do it. So those little shock protector springs, and that is, my gosh, ladies and gentlemen, that is a tiny, tiny jewel. I mean, the video doesn't really do it justice because we're zoomed in so much, but gosh, that thing is tiny. We'll go ahead and put that spring back into place so it doesn't move around during cleaning. And now we can go ahead and pull our terrain wheel bridge off. What I noticed here, these two screws I'm removing are on two different elevations of the bridge. And although don't really show it on camera, but I'm inspecting those two screws if I don't drop them, just to see if they're different. Because sometimes what you'll find is if the screws are, especially on an unfamiliar movement like this movement is to me, they can be a different length or one have a shoulder, one not have a shoulder or something. and just making sure if they are independent and unique to their positions on the part, that I'm making note of that. On this particular bridge, even though they were on different elevations, those screws were the same. Now our bridge can come off. There's just kind of like a film underneath it. Next up is our click. One screw to come off. And we can just use some Rodico to remove the click itself. The click spring is going to be on the underside of that train wheel bridge. Speaking of the train wheel bridge, that is held on by 2 screws. And these screws are on different elevations, and these screws are unique to their positions. That one on the bottom of the screen there, now on the right side of the screen, has a large shoulder on it, as opposed to no shoulder on the other screw. And I'm just kind of looking at the bridge because there's relief cuts on the side of the bridge where you can get in a tool to kind of wedge it up. And I'm just kind of finding those spots, working the bridge up, and now we can remove it. And we also have the crown wheel and intermediate crown wheel assemblies on that bridge. Here's our ratchet wheel, completely covered in oil, unnecessarily. And see how that black polish, it just looks black when the light's not hitting it just right. There's our 4th wheel. And look at all that red gunk on there. And that's a dye, a colored dye. And actually, you're not supposed to, on this particular movement, you're not supposed to lubricate that bottom part of the pivot. Rolex says to only lubricate the upper part up by the pinion, not that lower part. 3rd wheel came out. That's our bridge. And this part's got a cool name. This is called the Great Wheel. It functions, it's the 2nd wheel in the wheel train, so I would call it a 2nd wheel, but the part is called a Great Wheel. And here's our escape wheel. We have a pretty interesting hacking feature on this watch. As you can see, that little part that moves in and out as we pull the crown in and out actually will reach out and touch the rim of the balance wheel, thus stopping the watch and allowing you to set time to the second. And so that's just 2 little pieces stacked on one on top of the other that are activated by a post on the underside of the setting lever. Next up, we have our bridge for the minute pinion. And so the minute pinion, one may think of it as a center wheel, but it's actually not. And so what it is the great wheel that we pulled out earlier acts as the 2nd wheel in the wheel train after the barrel. And that connects to the 3rd wheel, 4th wheel, escape wheel, pallet fork, and balance. The minute pinion on here is also driven by the barrel, just like the great wheel. But the minute pinion acts as basically the center wheel on a regular wheel train, but it's not connected to the rest of the train bridge, or the train of wheels. And so it drives everything on the dial side of the watch, connects the hands and the motion works and all that together. So the train of wheels on this watch is driven separately than everything on the dial side because of that minute pinion. Pretty interesting way of doing it, and very effective. And it's not something we've actually shown on the channel before. So getting the keyless works disassembled, we removed our winding pinion and sliding clutch. And I actually believe Rolex calls it a sliding pinion. But we removed those 2 pieces from the rear side of the watch just because it was easy. We flip it over and we can remove our setting lever jumper. Normally it's called a setting lever spring. The manual actually calls it a jumper because the true setting lever spring, the spring that actually holds the setting lever down, is a separate part that we'll remove here in a moment. This here is the yoke spring. Pretty robust little spring, actually. And now we can remove our yoke. Next up, we have our cover plate for our winding and setting mechanism. And so this movement is a 2130. On a 2135, which is basically the same movement, but with a calendar function, this cover plate is going to have a few more pieces on the underside, but right here it just looks, we just have a intermediate setting wheel attached to that wheel. And my goodness, look at all the oil on underside of that. Yeah, that's 50 times more than you need, and you don't need it in those spots. Here's our setting wheel, and I'm just taking a look at it under the microscope to see if it's directional, if one side has a beveled edge to those teeth. It does not. Here's our minute wheel. And now we can remove our setting lever spring. And so again, this just puts constant downward pressure on the setting lever itself. That way, if you depress the pusher on the underside, on the other side of the watch, to remove your stem, this is the part that presses down on that setting lever, so it returns back to its normal position. It doesn't really want to come off that post there, so I'm just going to grab some Rodico to remove that. Taking a look at the underside of this part, and it's just completely caked in oil. Also, just, I mean, man, there's a lot of it. Lastly, here comes our setting lever. And you can see two studs kind of on there. One is the button that you press, and the other is a stud that pokes through and is actually what engages that hacking mechanism that we showed earlier. Next up, I want to remove the capstone from this lower escape wheel port. So the bottom jewel that's in this is in the setting, so it doesn't get removed. It stays in the watch. It's just part of the setting permanently. But we can pull our capstone out and then put the spring back into place. And we also need to remove the setting for the balance assembly itself. And so it's the same principle on here, except this capstone and the lower jewel, which is called a chaton, both get removed. So we'll go ahead and just use my little sticky tool here and pull that whole thing out. And when I put that in the cleaning agent, that chemical will separate those two pieces. And we'll just reattach that. And what's not really shown on the video is I do reattach the balance bridge and pull the same, do this exact same process with the upper balance jewel as well. Just making sure that screw gets, or that spring gets back in there like it should. That way it doesn't get damaged when it's going through the cleaning machine. It's tiny. Here you may have caught when we pulled this bridge out, we had a hair stuck in there. That's not my hair. I got a little gray, but it's not full-blown white yet. First thing I do here is I want to remove the click spring, and I kind of fumbled this up, and you'll kind of see it on the video. I mean, this spring's really reset into this bridge, and so I'm trying to remove tension on it, but I want to kind of reposition, and when I do, I don't really cover the part again with Rodico. And so as soon as it kind of comes free, that spring flies off in like a microsecond where you almost can't even tell, but it's, yeah, I mean, it really difficult to see right there, but that spring kind of flew off. Luckily, I have a backstop. It was just right there on my workbench. So no big deal, but that spring is thin and tiny and would fly a country mile. So getting this crown wheel assembly removed, you saw we have a reverse threaded screw there, and this is an intermediate crown wheel, and there is a core in that that'll get removed. That's the yoke sliding gear. And now the screw for our crown wheel itself. A little screw kind of came flying off there. There we go. And so we'll pull that crown wheel out, and there's also a core with that kind of centerpiece that it rotates around. So we're just going to go ahead and separate those two pieces. There we go. And that is the barrel bridge disassembled. Moving on to the automatic works. First thing we're going to do is just pull this little lever back here, and that is going to separate the oscillating weight from the automatic works bridge. And one thing that can get kind of worn on these is that post, that axle on the oscillating weight, and it's kind of got a square cut to it. I did check the side shake on that wheel before we separated it, and it was very, very minimal, and it should have only a tiny amount, but it looked great, and that axle was in really good shape. And thankfully, too, because in order to replace it, you have to have a special stake for a staking tool, and I don't have one of those, and those are unique to, you know, the movements, and so it saved me from having to buy a $30 tool to repair that part, but that one was in great shape. So we remove those three screws holding these two plates together. We can go ahead and separate this out. And outside of there just being a ton of oil kind of caked in there, I'm just going to leave this entire bit of footage in here, because what I'm doing is really making a mental note of how this thing gets reassembled. So it doesn't really make for kind of a good flow of a video, but what I'm doing is just kind of piecing this thing back together and just taking a mental picture of where each piece goes and what orientation it's in. So that wheel there is what connects to the axle itself, and that hole in the center is square cut. So as that oscillating weight rotates, that wheel's going to turn, and it'll turn the reversing wheels and that transmission wheel. So I'm just kind of taking a mental note of where those go. And so those reversing wheels that you see, those kind of red burgundy colored wheels, those are the wheels that allow this rotor to wind the watch and turn that transmission wheel in one direction, regardless of which direction the oscillating weight turns. The reason those things are the color that they are is those wheels are made of aluminum. Just the outside part, that red colored part, and that is a result of a surface treatment that Rolex does to those that they just say is for durability and longevity. But it's just become kind of iconic and associated with a Rolex. And you see the inside Rolex movement, you'll see those colored wheels, and you're like, oh, that's a Rolex movement. But it's due to the surface treatment that they do on those reversing wheels. The issue with those is underneath that C clip that you see on the outside rim of those wheels, there's a number of little cams and gears and springs, and that are very sensitive to any outside influence. And so these things have to have a special treatment in order to clean and lubricate them properly. And we're going to apply a surface treatment, an epilam surface treatment, also referred to as fix-a-drop. But they're very particular, and if any gunk gets in those, they can stop working. And so we definitely have a problem with one of those. Next up is the mainspring barrel. So we separate this out, and that's kind of, honestly, some people may hate a Seiko reference, but that's very Seiko-esque in the design of that barrel and how it separates. A lot of the 7000 series movements kind of work on the same principle, how you separate those barrels. But that thing comes off. We'll go ahead and begin disassembling and removing this barrel arbor. So this one came out really beautifully. And I don't know if this is a Rolex thing or what, but sometimes these can fight you a little bit and be a little bit stubborn. But this one absolutely was not. It came apart beautifully. That barrel looks to be in pretty good shape. And now I can begin the tedious process of manually unwinding and removing this mainspring. And I got to tell you, as I was unwinding it, I was honestly legitimately impressed at how much spring they managed to cram inside this barrel. I kept unwinding it, and I'm like, man, there's more, and this spring's getting longer and longer and longer. I'm like, the fact they were able to pack that big a spring in there is kind of impressive, because that's a tiny little barrel. Check that out. However, looking at it with the spring removed, you can see just the ocean of lubricant in this thing, and that darker grease is braking grease, and the more transparent grease is the main grease for the mainspring. And there is 100 times more grease than there should be in there. And over lubrication on a watch can be just as bad or potentially worse than under lubricating a watch. It can really stifle its ability to run properly. So what we're going to do here is begin pre-cleaning. And I'm just going to show you this main plate. The same process was followed on a lot of different parts. And I'm using pegwood to kind of break up all the loose grease, clean out all the jewels, and break up any loose items. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take a jar of naphtha and dunk this part in there. And I'm just going to use a little hold down tool and a simple little small paintbrush. And I'm just going to scrub both sides of this part. And it's going to clean 95% of everything off this part. Almost visually, good enough to reassemble the watch. But this does two factors. It ensures that after it goes through the cleaning machine, it's super clean. But also those cleaning fluids in those cleaning machines are very expensive. And so getting 95% of the major stuff off before we put it in there extends the life of those fluids too, and gives you a better result in the end. So we got that dried off. Got pre-cleaning done on the wheel train and the rest of the parts. And what we're doing here is just taking a look at the pivots on everything. We saw the escape wheel pivots. That's our great wheel. Now we're looking at our third wheel pivots. Looking good. There's our fourth wheel. We got that red gunk off there. There's the lower pivot. And now just a close-up of almost everything on the swatch. I realized later I didn't have the ratchet wheel in this photo, but that did get into the cleaning machine. And just taking a look at everything, and it's looking good. And one thing that's interesting is I took a look at this footage before they actually went in there, and I noticed right there on those arrows, I needed to do a little bit more cleanup on that transmission wheel, which I got that taken care of before we loaded the parts trays. So that was actually quite handy and a good timing, because I had to change batteries in the camera. So I was just looking at that footage. When I went in close up, I was like, you know what? I've got a few little spots of stuff between the teeth that I didn't see before. So that was pretty handy. Loading up the baskets on this, pretty simple. On this one, I have all the screws separate, and we're gonna clean those by hand, so I just don't lose track of them because I'm not familiar enough with this movement yet to kind of throw the screws in with everything else. It's easier for me to keep it organized if I clean those manually. We've got everything loaded in the baskets, and now we can move over to our Elma cleaning machine. So this machine, the first cycle is a wash cycle. It goes for, I think in this one, we did it for 9 minutes, which is a long one. And then 3 rinse cycles at 5 minutes each, and then a drying cycle. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to say thank you so much to the members of the Patreon community who support this channel. I really enjoy your engagement and talking with you, and your support of the channel goes so far and is just critical for me to keep this operation going. And I just want to say thank you very, very much. I really do mean that. Thank you so much. If you're interested, you can take a look at the link that was on the screen. So we begin assembling all the sub-assemblies for this watch before we start putting the watch together. And what we're going to do here is put the barrel together. So I'm applying some braking grease just to the wall of the inside of the barrel. And what that braking grease does, this grease is going to do the same. It's not the same color as which you saw on the dirty footage, but it was the darker grease in that dirty footage. I'm reapplying here, but much less quantity and in the proper spot. We only want this on the barrel walls. Little lubrication in there for the center post for the barrel arbor on that center hole. And now we have a brand new mainspring to put in. So what I'm doing here is when I'm putting this in, I'm just making sure I'm pushing the side in first that has the bridle. And I'll find that when I put the bridle in first and I get that kind of started, everything else just kind of falls into place pretty good. But when you're installing these new mainsprings from these washers, if the bridle side doesn't go in first, something you can really be in for a challenge getting that spring in. But that one went in beautifully. Next up, we can reinstall our barrel arbor. And just like when it came out, it went in just super easy. Probably the easiest one I've ever done. Maybe that's a Rolex thing. I don't know, but I was pretty thankful I didn't have to fight that. And now I'm just lubricating the other pivot on the other side of that barrel arbor with some HP 1300. And now we can put our cap on. And as you saw how clean that barrel turned out, as opposed to how it looked when it went in, and how little lubrication visually you actually need on that in order for it to be functioning properly. And those new mainsprings come pre-lubricated, so I didn't have to apply any grease to that spring. It was already pre-done with a very thin film. But after we got the case or the barrel lid reattached, I'm just visually inspecting the barrel all the way around just to make sure that it's seated fully and that lid is not open on one side or the other. Next up is our balance jewels. And so we're really zoomed in on the microscope here, but I'm putting the capstone and the chaton together. And now we're going to use an automatic oiler to put some 9010 into that jewel setting. It's a pretty handy little tool. Sometimes it can be a bit frustrating, but after we apply oil, then I'm going to inspect it to make sure that the oil's there. And what we're looking for is see that circle in the middle, and that's that oil ring. And that's about the size we want. And we want it dead center over that pivot hole. So that's good. But now we need to do the exact same thing for the other side, because we have both upper and lower balanced jewel assemblies. So once again, with the automatic oiler and applying some lubrication, just like the other one. And I inspected that one as well, just to make sure I had the proper oil ring. Now we'll go ahead and get this thing installed. So as you can see, we have the balance mounted back on the bridge, which we left on for cleaning. And I was actually debating whether or not to, when I was talking to Scott about this watch, we were conversing back and forth during the project. And, I told him, I was like, man, that's, so I was thinking about cleaning this by hand, but, it survived. It's, when it's mounted in there, it'll be fine. It's just nerve wracking putting those in. I've never once had an issue having the balance mounted to the main plate when it goes through cleaning, but sometimes it still makes me nervous doing it, but we left it on there, and it's fine. It's meant to survive that, but just making sure that no other parts are loaded in the same tray as that in the cleaning machine. But we got the upper and lower jewels in. I only showed the upper, but we've got all the jewels in. checking the hairspring flatness and its spin, and just making sure that everything's running beautifully, and it is. But now I put those capstones in for the escape wheel dry, and so I'm using the automatic oiler to apply some 9010 to those as well. What I'm doing here is I'm showing a different method. Someone had asked me, and if they, because they didn't have an automatic oiler, and what you can do is if you have a like a bounce staff pivot or something really small, you can put a dab of oil in there, and that hole, and it's tiny. And now I can use a regular oiler, and then as you see, capillary action will pull oil into that capsule just like you saw, and then just use a little bit of Rodico to clean up any oil that may be on the outside of the jewel. And that's a really effective method of oiling those capstones if you don't have an automatic oiler. Because the issue is, if you pre-oil the jewel before you install it, you have to drop that jewel just dead center perfect in that setting. Otherwise, the oil will spread. And I'll tell you, I mean, I'm still not very good at it. So I prefer to assemble them dry and then oil them after the fact. And that's a handy way of doing it, because you can get that little, that tool I use with just the tiniest little metal rod on the tip of it is like $10 or something. I think Bergeon makes a version of the exact same thing that costs probably 50, but I mean, you can buy a non-Bergeon branded one. I mean, it's not like you're buying, a high-tech part. It's just a metal stud that's small enough to fit inside the hole in the jewel. It's not a complicated tool, but a super handy little trick that I once saw, and I use regularly, and you can really dial in just the exact amount of oil you want in a capstone. Oiling it from the backside, just make sure to clean up use some Rodico to clean up any oil that didn't get pulled into the setting. So we have our intermediate crown wheel, and that's sliding yoke assembled. Got everything lubricated and the reverse threaded screw in there, and you can see it's running nice and free. And now we need to assemble our crown wheel itself. So the first thing I'm doing is applying some lubrication to the post, and then just a tiny little dab here on the base of the plate, and that's where the core for the crown wheel is going to sit, and a little on the outside of the post for the core where the crown wheel is going to sit. And I'll tell you, I was really impressed with this crown wheel. I mean, just to think, because again, we're really zoomed in, and I don't know if you're watching on a phone or on a television, but I mean, if this footage is really blown up, but yeah, this part is very tiny, and the amount of machining that went into this crown wheel is just incredible on such a tiny part. It's really impressive, and it's not just a Rolex thing. I mean, Seikos and Citizens have parts like this also that are, the amount of machining it takes in order to make that part is impressive, and to do it on such a small scale is really quite something. So I was kind of marveling at that part. We're reattaching our click spring into place, and this is a super thin click spring. It's a lot more difficult for me to handle these than it is a thicker spring, even though it's smaller and there's less tension on it. Sometimes it can be a lot more difficult to install those, but there's just the tiniest bit of undercut to that bridge, and we got that put into place. Now we need to apply some fix-a-drop, and so what fix-a-drop is, it's an epilam treatment that we referenced earlier. This is a stearic acid, if I remember the term, but what it does is it reduces the surface tension of these parts. And what it is, it's a stearic acid in an alcohol base. And so we're going to put the reversing wheel parts in here, flip it over. And generally, I mean, most of the time it says to soak these for like 20 to 30 seconds. The Rolex documentation on this movement say they want their parts soaked for 2 to 3 minutes. So we're going to go ahead and soak these parts and just let them soak. What this is going to do after those things have been fully cleaned is you dry them off, and then you want to let them sit for about 15 minutes on a non-reactive surface. So like paper. I use a Post-it note, watchmaker's paper, but if you put on like a plastic parts tray, that stearic acid can react to that material, but just on a non-reactive surface. So paper works well. But I got all these parts laid out, and we'll go ahead and get those covered and let them sit for about 15 minutes. What this does is it repels oil. So what stearic acid does, it reduces the surface tension of the material you're working on a microscopic, puts it like a nanometer thick layer of this surface treatment. What it does is, like, if you just wax your car, and by the way, the only thing we're going to lubricate on these reversing wheels is the tiniest amount of I'm using HP 1300 here as a modern replacement for the original lubricant on the post, and that's it. That's the only piece on the inner assembly that we're going to lubricate. Everything else is dry. But if you put a nice wash and a wax coat on your car, you notice how water will beat up and it'll kind of form bubbles on the surface. It won't spread out. It'll just kind of form little balls and roll off. Basically the same concept when you reduce that surface tension. On a watch, the purpose of this epilam treatment is to repel oil, where it'll keep oil where you want it and where it won't spread to where you don't want it. And what we don't want is any oil in those parts whatsoever. And these aren't the only parts we're going to apply that treatment to, but it is vital for these parts for them to function properly. And generally speaking, on these watches, the reason you would do an epilam treatment is not really if it doesn't affect performance more than it does extend service life. And so, like on the escapement, which we're going to apply an epilam treatment for the escapement in this watch, as well as an epilam treatment for the fourth wheel, which is something that most of the time you don't do, but the Rolex's material, it's just because you only lubricate one specific part on that fourth wheel, and they don't want oil spreading to other places. So we apply that lubrication. So oil's going to stay where you put it and not spread to where that epilam treatment is. So after that long-winded spiel, we got the automatic works reassembled. And now I'm just applying a little bit of lubrication just to the pivots on each side of that. We'll rotate this over. And no lubrication yet to the center wheel pivot for the axle, because we're going to lubricate the axle itself before we install it. But there we go. It does not take much lubrication on these, just a tiny little bit. And now there's a couple specific points on this axle that need lubrication, so I'm making sure those got addressed. And again, that axle has a square cut on it, and it fits in that square hole on that center gear. So once those things line up, it'll drop down into place right there. And now I need to push this little arm back in. And actually, in hindsight, I noticed right here, I didn't get it in all the way. And I noticed it really, when I picked it up to move it over, I didn't push it in far enough, but no big deal. I will attach it properly later. It does take a significant click in order for that thing to go into place. But what I'm doing is I'm rotating this around and I'm watching that one brass wheel, that transmission wheel. And regardless of which direction I spin this assembly, that transmission wheel is rotating in one direction. And that's telling me that right now those things are running like they should. So we're going to do one more fix-a-drop treatment. And I'm going to put the escape wheel and fourth wheel in here and do the same treatment. What's not shown on camera, but I also treated the pallet fork. And this epilam, this fix-a-drop, evaporates extremely quickly. Like, have you ever used a can of brake cleaner? It evaporates as fast as brake cleaner does. So, and it's not a cheap, a cheap solution to get. So, exposure to the outside air is, I keep minimal, but I just dip just the tips of the pallet jewels in there and not the pivots, and apply that treatment to those as well. So what we're doing here is I'm using a bit of pith wood on the outside of the pith wood, and I'm putting the pivots into this pith wood. And what it's going to do is it's going to remove this epilam treatment just from the pivots, because I want it on the part, but not on the pivots themselves. And we did the escape wheel there. And now I'm just going to do the upper pivot of the fourth wheel. And I just use a tad bit of Rodico just to make sure everything's nice and clean. And now all those pre-assemblies are now complete, and we can actually put this watch together. So we're going to begin by putting this minute pinion in. And there's two little points on the underside of that. We need to make sure we have lubrication. So we got that done. And then a little bit on the top here where it's going to connect with the jewel bridge. So now we can drop this bridge into place, and you can see just how well that main plate and everything cleaned up. That is one shiny little part. We get these two screws put into place. And so that surface finish that you see on that main plate with all those little circles, that's called perlage. And that's applied just by using an abrasive, basically a tiny little wheel, and those are applied one at a time just by a spinning disc that creates that finish on those parts. And it's a pretty time intensive process to put on, but it's a very traditional s- finish done on a lot of Swiss watches, and it's just really beautiful. We got our great wheel in, our mainspring bell went in, and now we can put our third wheel into place. And at first, you can see on camera, it actually dropped right into the pivot, and I didn't even notice it was already dead on. And I moved the wheel, and now I'm positioning it again, and there it goes, dropped into place. So on the fourth wheel, Rolex says to only lubricate the upper part of that right by the pinion. So we got that lubricated properly and dropped into place. Next up is our escape wheel. You see that escape wheel is black polished as well. Well, the whole thing is shiny or none of it is. Really beautiful parts in this watch. You see our nice and cleaned up ratchet wheel. No longer absolutely caked in oil. And now we can put our barrel bridge into place. And I'll tell you right now, I missed something here. And so I should not have put this bridge on yet, but I'll figure that out here in a moment. But the bridge did fit on quite nicely. We'll go ahead and reattach these two screws holding it down. And these two screws are different screws, so they're unique to each position. Making sure they're tight. Now we can put on our train wheel bridge. So just kind of getting this lined up. And I wanted to just give it a quick test to see if we got just extremely lucky, and we did not. It's not running freely just yet. So I wanted to give this thing the tapping trick. This is actually the first time I've tried a tapping trick on a Rolex. So we'll see what happens. Maybe we'll get lucky. No, not yet. And of all things, looking closer at it, actually, normally it's the escape wheel that kind of holds these things up. On this one, it wasn't. It was the fourth wheel. So just a little touch of the fourth wheel, making sure that upper pivot found its home. And there we go. Now that we know that all the train wheel pivots are where they should be, we can go ahead and get these screws installed. And I'm not tightening them just yet. I'm just kind of getting them down, but not torqued. And by torqued, there's not a lot of torque at all. It's very minimal, but just snug. But we're going to give it one more check just to make sure that everything's good once everything's screwed down. I'm liking it. Everything seems to be moving pretty well. And now I can just snug those screws. Next thing I want to do is install the click. So I'm applying just the tiniest amount of grease to the tip of that click spring that's on the underside of the bridge, and it just kind of pokes out there. And a little bit of lubrication to the post where that click is going to ride. And we can go ahead and drop that thing into place. And what's nice about this one is it's not spring loaded. There's spring tension on it when it moves, but when it's in its resting position, there's no tension on it. So that thing just drops in quite nicely. A little bit of cleanup. And here's where I realized I was going to put in the hack. And I'm like, well, there's just the tiniest amount of overhang on that bridge where the hack belongs. And it's by design so that hack can't come out without removing that bridge. It does keep it from being removed. But visually, before I put it in, I thought that I could squeeze it in with that bridge still in place, but I could not. So pop that bridge back off, and we'll go ahead and reinstall this hack. So that bottom piece, that's the piece, that hole in the bottom side is what the setting lever connects with. And that, vertical piece on the end of it is what actually physically touches the edge of the balance rim. So I kind of need to orient those because there's a little location hole, a locating post on the bottom side of that top piece. Make sure that's pressed down all the way and in its spot. There we go. There it dropped down. Now I can put my bridge back on again. And you can see where that bridge is. It's going to be right where that screw goes in. And there is just the tiniest bit of overhang right there. But that's just enough to not allow that part to be removed or installed without that barrel bridge being removed first. But one more time. There we go. Screws are back in, making sure they're snug. And now we're good to go. Next thing we're going to do is lubricate the wheel train before we go any further. So we're applying some lubrication first to the rear side of the watch. That's our barrel arbor port. And there's our great wheel. Here's our third wheel. And our fourth wheel. Flipping the movement over, we can lubricate, again, our third wheel, our great wheel, and our lower barrel arbor port. And we've already lubricated both the upper and lower escape wheel jewels in those capstones during installation. And the next thing I'm going to do is install the cannon pinion. And that's press fit into place, and it gives a nice affirmative click when it's actually pressed down all the way, which is kind of nice to hear. Had a lot of TV noise going on in the background, but that's why you didn't hear it. And now we can begin putting together this keyless work, because I need to get all the keyless works put in to be able to wind this watch before we put in the rest of the escapement in balance. So we got those two pieces lubricated, and I'm putting a tiny bit of grease here on the inside lip of the main plate where that winding pinion is going to go. That drops into place, and that winding pinion is what connects to the crown wheel in order to wind the watch. There's our sliding clutch, or I believe Rolex calls it a sliding pinion. And take their word over mine, so maybe I should just start calling it a sliding pinion. And a little bit of grease inside that inner recess where the yoke is going to sit. And now we're going to lubricate the post for the yoke. And lastly, we're going to lubricate this little piece here where the post for that pusher for the setting lever is going to go. So we can get that put into place. And that other smaller little post there, what I'm doing is I just want to make sure that's lined up with that little hole on that little part for the hack that we installed earlier. It needs to go through that little hole. So I'm just making sure that's lined up before we press it down. Let's give it a little move, and I can actually see that hack moving through that little visible hole there. The tip of this setting lever, I'm applying grease where it's going to interact with the yoke. And I'm incorrectly applying lubrication to this post here. I was, thinking that's where the setting lever spring was going to go because my brain just went there for some reason. That's not the right location. I'm going to have to clean that off here in a minute and lubricate the proper one when I realize my mistake, but it's not the end of the world. Our yoke goes in. Now we can get our yoke spring put into place. Before we set tension on it, I want to lubricate the back side of the yoke where that spring is going to engage. So we're just going to put a dab of grease right here. And now we can hold down that spring and pull it into place. And when it is, that's where it's going to touch on that yoke. Right there. Now I was going to do the setting lever spring, and I realized my mistake. And now I'm putting oil in the correct position on that setting lever. And again, there's always just going to be one constant pressure 100% of the time right there. And so just a little dab of grease will do. There we go. Now we can go ahead and get that screw tightened down. This is the post for the setting lever, or setting wheel, rather, excuse me. And for the minute wheel. Setting wheel can go into place. And our minute wheel. And so that cover plate that covers all those parts has an intermediate setting wheel on it. So what we're going to do is just apply a little bit of lubrication to that. That wheel does not separate from the plate. So just a little dab. I'm using HP 1300 right there. And we can go ahead and get this put into place. And what I'm wanting to make sure of is that intermediate setting gear that's attached to that plate is meshed correctly with the primary setting gear that I'm adjusting now. And that's what you see me kind of doing, just kind of rotating that around. And it's made a lot easier by the fact that we don't have the crown or the stem in yet, and that the yoke spring is pushing that setting gear backwards. So it's not really interfering with it. Next up, we can get our setting lever jumper put into place. Kind of awkward to get it into place when there's not, when the spring doesn't have tension on it sitting on top of the post, but we get that lined up. And now I'm just applying some heavy grease to the tip of that where it's going to gauge on that post of the setting lever. So we'll get some grease put on there and go ahead and set tension on it. And then once we put in the crown and stem and work that around, that grease will kind of work its way in and get into all the positions it needs to go, and then we can clean up the excess. So now we need to go ahead and lubricate the stem, and I'm applying some grease to a few different points on here where it needs to be. We can go ahead and pop this into place. So we get this stem in and push it in, and that one clicked into place quite nicely. We'll pull it in and out a few times, and as we do, the grease will kind of move around, especially on that setting lever jumper, and it immediately becomes much easier to manipulate. Once we did, we clean up the excess, give it one more test. Everything seems to be feeling pretty good. I'm liking it. Now we flip the movement back over and we can install our pallet fork. And so what we did with that same fix-a-drop treatment, we applied just to the tips of the jewels on this pallet fork and not the whole thing. It just makes life easier just doing it that way. Once that thing's into place, we'll go ahead and put our bridge in. But since we've applied fix-a-drop to the escapement parts, the escapement, that fix-a-drop, again, it repels lubricant. So what you don't really want is fix-a-drop where you want the lubricants. So what we're going to do is actually run this watch without escapement lubrication at first for about 20 minutes. And it's going to wear off that epilam treatment just on the surfaces where we want oil to remain. And again, it doesn't really affect performance. What it does is affect service life and the service life interval. And so we get that put in, got the screws tightened down. We apply a little bit of tension to the mainspring, put a few winds in it, and now we're just checking the action on the pallet fork. It's engaging and disengaging, looking great. Now comes time to do the balance. This is always the most nerve-wracking part. So we get that balance in. That it found that lower jewel, the lower pivot hole, quite nicely. I rotate it around, and it does not want to kick off at first. So I'm just kind of manipulating it. It's not really set down where it needs to be just yet. And so I'm just kind of taking a look. And oop, it wants to go. Ah, there we go. Okay, good deal. Always nice to see those things kind of come to life after you install it, thankfully. We get our screw tightened down. And now what I want to do is just kind of let this balance run again for 20 minutes or so. I'm not doing any regulation on it whatsoever. So after I give it time to run in a little bit, it's going to, again, wear off that fix-a-drop treatment on the tips of the pallet fork stones and on the side where the stop happens and in the locking action of that pallet fork. And it's also going to wear off just on the tip of the escape wheel teeth. So now we'll go ahead and very gently remove our balance. There we go. Now it can come off. Oop. Okay, good. And now what I want to do is just apply some 9415 escapement grease to this, because again, this is a high beat movement and this escape wheel has 21 teeth. And so what we're going to do is apply the lubrication to the tip of the teeth and apply it to 7 teeth on this watch. And then repeat that process a total of 3 times. What you're looking at is a view from the dial side of the watch, because with that pallet fork bridge, the way it is, there's no access to on the rear side. But now we install the balance one more time, and had some rare occasion where I had pretty decent camera footage from multiple cameras. So we'll go ahead and add this in there. But this time, putting the balance in, it went kind of nice. It just kind of, boom, dropped right into place and started working. And I love it when that happens. So this watch definitely wants to run. Go ahead and get this thing tightened down for the final time. And now, first thing we're going to do, do this in every watch, but don't always show it. We're going to go ahead and demagnetize this thing. So I splurged last year and bought this kind of overpriced, but still very cool demagnetizer. It's not the automatic one where you can hit a button and it, does multiple passes on it like that Horatech one, but it is rather effective at removing magnetism from tools as well. But here we're going to check the hack, and as you can see, when we pull the crown out, it stops. So what we do, I'm going to zoom in here and throw an arrow up, and you see that that's called a microstella nut. It's a weighted nut, and there's two of them on this balance wheel that are 180 degrees apart. And in order to regulate this watch, you have to move those. Whatever adjustment you make to one, you have to make to the other side to keep the balance in poise. You need a special tool to do that. This is called a microstella wrench. So those little indicator notches on that clear part, one notch of that, and you can see the shape of that nut that this thing attaches to. On this particular watch, one of those notches represents 1.8 seconds, but you have to do it to both sides to keep the balance in poise. So this watch has only been running again for about 30 minutes since doing that adjustment. So the oils have not settled in yet, but as you can see, we are just running dead on. It looks great. The trace, I forgot to hit record initially, and so that other trace is actually, it's been testing, and that was dial up. This is dialed down, and it's almost running 0 seconds per day in both directions. Amplitude's going to rise up a good 20 degrees, 25 degrees as it runs in. So I'm just thrilled with the performance on this watch. Really happy. As that runs in, I'm turning my attention to the case. And so this is a bezel removal tool. And thankfully, this watch is very small. It's a 26 millimeter watch, and it almost didn't bite into that. That wedges in between the bezel and the case, and you can see it separates it just a little bit. It gives me enough room now. Although I forgot apparently how to, put things on camera. I forgot where my camera was aimed. I'm using some plastic, and now I have room to just pop this little tool in and get that gold bezel separated. But that separator did just have just enough room to begin to separate this bezel. So that, thankfully, because those are a tight fit. But now I'm separating the crystal and the crystal gasket from the bezel. There we go. And that is a solid gold, 18 karat gold bezel. And I'm being very careful with that because gold is a softer material. And now here's our crystal. And so this is a sapphire crystal. We're going to go ahead and replace it. It's tough to scratch a sapphire. The sapphire crystals are not unscratchable, but it just takes a lot to do it. We're going to go ahead and replace that. Pull the gasket out of the crown, or out of the case tube rather. And now we can use this ridiculously expensive tool, but absolutely necessary. We're going to go ahead and remove the crown tube from this watch. So in talking to Scott, actually real quick here, we're going to go ahead and straighten that stem. So that's not an issue, but there was that inside that stem. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Arrival. I'm kind of a sci-fi geek. That alien movie, that weird language that they use. If you ever seen that movie Arrival and that circular language they use, that's what that little thing looked like. Only the people who've seen that movie will know that reference. But there was no gasket in that crown whatsoever. So in talking with Scott about this watch, we talked about the case, and it looked a lot worse under macro. There was a lot of scratches on it. It didn't look that bad in person, but he said, Adam, let's clean up the case a little bit. Don't go full crazy on it, but just kind of remove the surface scratches that you can. Don't go nuts with it. So that's what we're doing here. We're using some gray Dialux, and this is a medium felt wheel. I've got some heat tape covering the actual gold center links on this. So we're only really addressing the stainless steel right now. Once the buffing is done in the cutting compound, I'm using a soft cotton mop, and we're using some green Dialux to put a polish on this thing. And again, heat tape right now just to cover that center gold. And now we're using my softest mop in red Dialux. Red Dialux is really meant for precious metals. It's the lightest polishing compound there is, but it cleans up gold quite nicely. Now I want to apply brushing to the stainless steel part of the outside links on the bracelet, and then the top of the case and all that. So I reapply heat tape to cover the gold, so none of the gold will be affected by this. And so what I'm doing is I'm using some 3M, basically Scotch-Brite pads. And you can, with the volume of brushing that you do and the various grades of these 3M Scotch-Brite pads that you use, you can achieve the graining finish that you desire. It's kind of important to keep track of how many strokes you do per side. That way you can treat the bracelet and the case with the same amount of strokes and keep the graining finish the same across everything. But you can achieve some really good results with that. So I have the gold taped over, and I had the sides taped over. Next up, and so anything that was taped is going to just remain fully polished. Now I'm starting out with some 320 grit sandpaper, and I want to apply brushing to the center part of this case back. So what I'm doing right now is using slower, heavier strokes on this 320 grit just to kind of get it started. Now I'm going to move to 800 grit and use a little bit lighter stroke and just kind of work my way over, just getting fresh sandpaper every couple strokes. And you can really see the finer sandpaper you go, the finer the graining you can do. And on the very last stage that I'm going to do, I'm just going to do extremely just light touch strokes, very light. And that final one kind of gives me the surface finish that I'm looking for. And I'll tell you, that thing did not turn out half bad. Just some sandpaper and a way to orient that thing. That way you can keep it straight. And I'll tell you, you can achieve really good graining. Next up, I just want to throw this bezel into this jewelry cleaning and brightening solution. It does a great job of just cleaning this up. And I should mention that between each stage of polishing and all that, we had an ultrasonic cleaning every single time. And so just to kind of keep one piece from being contaminated with another. So once all the polishing and all the casework had been done and we got the cleaning and brightening solution in there, we're going to go ahead and drop everything in one final time into the ultrasonic just to do a final clean on everything. And we'll see what kind of tune our ultrasonic has in store for us today. All right, and everything came out quite nicely. I'm pretty pleased with it. We applied again brush finish to the clasp, but left the sides full polish, and I'm really pleased with that. Moving our attention back to the movement, I'm putting the 2 case screws back in and tightening them down fully. Because remember, on this, in order to secure the movement into the case, you have to loosen those screws where that large kind of head of the screw grips onto the case from the underside of that lip. So the loose position is fully tightened. A little bit of lubrication to the cane and pinion, and our hour wheel can go into place. Now we can put our dial back on. And you can see just again, those little tiny little spots are only visible under macro on the wrist. This thing is just a gorgeous, gorgeous blue and gold dial. Really pretty. Want to get the crown tube reattached to the case. So this KT22 is a specialized silicone lubricant. Rolex calls for it specifically, actually, but it's a fantastic sealing lubricant used for multiple things and not just watches, but does a great job of waterproofing this crown tube. So we'll apply a little bit of it there and go ahead and screw this thing back into the case. Threads on that crown tube were actually in basically perfect shape. So a lot of times on Rolexes, those are replaced. This thing did not need it. It was just perfect. So we're good there. And now we need to orient this case where the crown on the 12 o'clock position is really at about the 1 o'clock position to allow those screw heads to have clearance. Now we can go ahead and flip this thing around. We got it put into place. And now what we need to do is rotate this entire movement and dial assembly into the correct spot. And it's oriented by aligning the hole for the stem with the crown tube. Once that's where it needs to be, I want to go ahead and reinstall this crown. And we're not done with this crown, by the way. I'm just installing it right now for the purposes of aligning the movement properly into the case and tightening it down. But we'll pop that crown in. And I didn't want to force it, so I'm just going to go ahead and depress the setting lever post while pushing the crown in, and right there. Pops into place. And I'm going to go ahead and tighten it on that crown tube and screw it down all the way. Now that movement is right where it needs to be, we're going to go ahead and loosen these screws. That way again, that little head, that large washer head of that screw kind of grips the case from the underside of that lip. And now that thing's not going to move on us. So it's time to set the hands, and we're going to go ahead and put the hour hand on first. It does not matter the orientation of this hour hand because we do not have a calendar function on this watch. We can put that hour hand on in any position. Once we get that pressed down, and that's actually honestly a real tight squeeze on that hand, We rotate it around to 12 o'clock, mount our minute hand, and press that down as well. And now I've got the crown tube for the seconds hand. I've got the crown tube pulled out. That way the hack is engaged. And that's why the second hand isn't moving. So you can see that second hand press down. Light touches. Now we can push it back in and it comes alive on us. We can see that second hand move. Double check clearance on all that to make sure the hands were working and nothing was interfering with one another. I'm sorry, I forgot to hit record when I put the crystal and the crystal gasket on the case. So sorry about that, but put that on. Now we can put our bezel on into place. And again, this is a tight squeeze, folks. And I tell you, if I hadn't purchased this screw down crystal press several months ago, I doubt my little hand presses would have been enough, even for this small watch, to depress that on there. Because I'll tell you what, they are not kidding around when they say oyster, being their term for water resistant. There is no way moisture's going to get into this watch from the crystal side of things, because that's a tight squeeze on that bezel and fresh gasket. But we got that in there and pressed down evenly, thankfully, because we had the proper tool to do it. Next up, just wanted to kind of show this reattachment. I mentioned earlier that I didn't fully engage the clip on the automatic works. So, when I put it back on the part, I noticed I didn't have it in all the way. So I put it in the parts tray separated. And now we can put this in and press this clip in fully, and it will fully snap into place. Boom. There we go. Now we can go ahead and put this thing into the watch. So in order to get this thing seated properly, the transmission wheel, which is that brass wheel on the automatic works, needs to engage with the crown wheel that's on top of the mainspring barrel. And the best way to accomplish that, and you need to do it without really applying a lot of pressure to anything, so just very light downward pressure on that while we wind the watch. And as I turn this crown and press downward pressure on this automatic works assembly, you'll see it drop down into place. Right there. Very difficult to see, but now you can see that transmission wheel moving when I wind the watch. And that tells us that everything is meshed together properly. Awesome. Now there's 2 screws that hold this assembly down. Making sure those are snug. And again, this is really just my OCD doing this. Just to make sure. I want to just double check everything to make sure it's good. And I just want to give it a test once more. The rotor isn't, it isn't touching anything. It's moving freely. All the gears are meshing. The side shake on that rotor is perfect. And now the real test I want to see is if we still have a helicopter effect, and we do not. And I was telling Scott, I said, Scott, I don't know if we're going to have to replace those reversing wheels until I basically get this watch totally together. But winding feels 100 times better. And I'm just very, very happy to see that this is, operating like it should. However, I still need to install a new gasket in this crown. So we'll go ahead and separate it out one more time. Put a new gasket in the crown tube as well. So we'll get that in, just kind of press it in by hand. And then I'm just going to use some tweezers just to make sure it's seated in that little channel inside there all the way around. And I did apply some fresh silicone grease to that. I cleaned up all the grease off this stem. And now we applying a fresh gasket in there. And I'm going to clean up whatever silicone grease may have gotten on the stem and then reapply just a very tiny coat of that heavy grease one last time, because there's already some inside the parts. So I'm just going to clean off some of the excess that I put on there, because I just want a little light film, really. That's all it needs. And for one final time, we can go ahead and put this crown into place. And again, I'll just kind of hold it and press it in slightly as I push down that plunger, and boom, pops into place. And now we can go ahead and just double check function. Everything's working like it should. We can go ahead and tighten the crown down. And I want to make sure that, Becky didn't have any problems with this watch, and that there's no way it's going to get moisture in here again. So lastly, last gasket on here is going to be a fresh case back gasket. Applied some silicone grease to it, and just making sure that gasket is flat and not twisted. Perfect. Now we can go ahead and put our case back on. And what I didn't really show earlier is that I had to use the big tool to loosen the case back to start. As you can see, these case backs require a special, you know, a special die for the case back tool, a special opener to kind of attach those. So this is how I loosened it originally. We're going to go ahead and tighten it properly with this tool. Beautiful. Next up, we want to reattach the bracelet. And as you can see, these original spring bars were in definite need of replacement. So we got some new spring bars, and now we can go ahead and reattach our bracelet. Already got the first side in. We'll go ahead and put the second side in. And the same treatment, both polishing and brushing that was done on the bracelet was also done to the end links on this as well. So we just get that first spring bar side in, and now we can pull the second one back and kind of get it in there. Sometimes these can be a little bit troublesome to, locate those spring bars into the lug holes. But that one went in. Once I hear it click into place, just give it a quick test. Everything's secured into place, and this watch is really coming together. Last thing we have to do here is reattach, connect the bracelet and the two bracelet pieces together at the clasp. So a different size spring bar for that. Clean up a little smudge mark on the side of the clasp. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of fiddle with this thing, lock the clasp, make sure that feels good, and it feels great. And just kind of taking a look at this watch. And I'll tell you, as we did this, and Becky, you probably, if you do watch this video at Christmas, I hope it does eventually find you. And I wanted you to know that your dad was so excited about this watch, and we were in constant communication through this process. I'm really pleased with how it turned out. As I record this audio, your dad got the watch back today, and he was so excited for Christmas. And so he's like, she's going to flip when she sees it. So, and I certainly hope you do. It's a really great watch, and enjoy it, and wear it when you're saving people on those helicopter flights. It's take care of the watch and it'll take care of you. It's a really good quality piece. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks again to the patrons of this channel. I really appreciate your support a lot. A special quick shout out to Anthony, Mark, Matthew, Mike, Frank, and Danny, our newest supporters. Thank you all so very much. It means an awful lot, and probably couldn't do this channel without your support. It means the world to me. So thank you again. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're interested in the channel, you can also, I post stuff up on Instagram. Occasionally post up what I'm working on and all that. People send questions, I try to answer what I can, and just thank you again for everything. Folks, that's the video. That's the watch. Becky, Merry Christmas. Hope you enjoy it. Ladies and gentlemen, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you again on the next one real soon. Take care. Bye.